Hi, Gregg Perry here, the Historic Preservationist, in a bit of isolation still with the virus, but we're pushing forward with our fourth episode on the Roku network, and we're talking about first glass making in America, Wistar glass. In 1739 through 1777, a few glass houses were established in the American colonies in the 175 years of settlement before the Revolution. Very little is known about these startups, and only a few objects can positively be associated with them. A lot of times there were no labels, no benchmarks, nothing of the sort. All of the glassworks in the 17th century failed. At the beginning of the 18th century, in 1738, the next generation of glass houses was engendered in Alloway Town, New Jersey, right where we're sitting today on the banks of the Alloway Lake. This is located about 45 minutes south of Philadelphia and 35 minutes east of Delaware. The factory complex was built by Caspar Worcester, a German immigrant who lived in Philadelphia. The factory endured for nearly 40 years, producing glass continuously until the Revolutionary War. Other colonial entrepreneurs endeavored into glassmaking, but none could repeat the success of Worcester. We must remember Worcester's success was based in flat, plain glass for windows. Well, other things were blown also. But the first glass houses were built in Jamestown, Virginia in 1706 and 1721 under the premise of sending the glasswares back to England due to glass makers struggling to compete with continental products. By the end of the 17th century, English glassmakers had risen to prominence for their brilliant and heavy lead formula for table glass. The American colonies at this point were a burgeoning market for these wares. So Worcester has a store in Philadelphia, he's producing flat glass and some blown glass. There were a few ambitious startup colonists like the Worcesters who were determined to compete with British imports, making their own bottles, window panes, and tableware. Glass houses required considerable capital to erect and maintain, and the manufacturing process was based on raw materials of very specific properties. And when these manufacturers would find these properties, they would keep them quite sotto voce, keep them under cover. The greatest barrier was finding the trained craftsmen to aid and abet in such a startup process. For glassmaking was long considered an art and quite mysterious, creating this beautiful, transparent, hard surface by melting sand. In addition, British immigration restrictions of most artisans meant that most glassblowers who came to the colonies hailed from continental Europe, especially from Central Europe and Bohemia. Caspar Worcester was a German immigrant who had arrived in September in 1717. Worcester, coming to the colonies, had no formal education. He came seeking economic opportunity and freedom. While his story is one of great success, but while living in Hilsbach, he traveled to nearby Heidelberg, and from there he set forth to Rotterdam to embark on the ship to bring him to Philadelphia. When he landed on the docks, he had but 9 pence to his name, a similar scenario like that of Benjamin Franklin, who landed on South Street with a few pence and a loaf of bread. He soon took up an apprenticeship as a brass button maker. Within 4 years, he broke the apprenticeship and opened a small manufacturing and retail outlet on Market Street. Success quickly arrived for him. He was quite industrious, and in his endeavor, he eventually trained his son Richard, who carried on the business here in Alloway's Town into 1770. Brass buttons were key, particularly when getting contracts with the British and American military. Buttons were generally made in 2 parts, the base, which incorporated an eye to be threaded to the apparel, and the top, which would be stamped, engraved, and the seam would be rolled around the base button. And don't forget, a lot of these contracts were probably aided and abetted by his neighbor, Benjamin Franklin. I'm sure he put a good word in for him. There were a multitude of button designs needed, where initials of various fonts and insignias to a coat of arms, etc. Hence, buttons were a necessary part of 18th century colonial clothing, particularly in the military, as we said, and produced from silver to brass, and sometimes wood and bone. In the period, the brass ones were designed for utility rather than show, and chosen the strength rather than for fashion. Wistar guaranteed his buttons for 7 years. Although Wistar's buttons were manufactured for the military, the majority of the sales were meant for the working class, the hard-working, the labor that built this country. The Wistar family, after Wistar mastered his trade, he acquired some property and turned to the Mattera family. He converted to the Quaker faith in 1725. So he came here not a Quaker, but he converted, one of the best moves in his life. So in 1725, he married Catherine Jansen. She was a prominent Germantown Quaker, and so was her family. This move was highly strategic for Wistar's future success. So it's always good to marry into success and money, I guess, huh? A sound financial move indeed, because Philadelphia's rapidly expanding economy was largely due to the efforts of only a few select Quakers. So the Quakers were the movers and shakers in the beginning of our colonies when it came to monetary situations. The ties of religion were strong, and even though he was German and probably never became fluent, Wistar was assimilated into the elite group running the colonies. This clearly put Wistar on a path to success. During the 35 years he lived in America, he amassed one of the greatest fortunes of the period. Pretty amazing stuff from someone who arrived here with just a few pence. At his death in 1752, his estate was valued at £26,000, a sum that did not include the Alloway town, which we're sitting here, Alloway Glassworks, or his other lands in New Jersey. The most plausible explanation of his financial success is that he was an extraordinary land speculator and thus created the bulk of his fortune by selling and buying of land. A lot of that occurred in Pennsylvania. By 1738, he was successful enough to consider the enormity of an investment in a highly risky business in glassmaking in Allowaystown. So he made money and then he pumped it here into Allowaystown for Wistarburg. A special act of the Pennsylvania Assembly in 1724 enabled Wistar to sell and to buy and to hold lands in the province of Pennsylvania. He quickly became a real estate mogul in his day. In 1730, Wistar bought 2,000 acres for £7 per 100 acres. 7 years later, he sold the tract for £53 per 100 acres in Pennsylvania currency. This was only the beginning of many multiple land deals which made Wistar a very important and rich man in this period of the 18th century. On official government correspondence, Wistar is always identified as a merchant, a term which reflects another aspect of his business life. He had a retail store on Market Street in Philadelphia, in addition to his button manufacturing. His retail store was somewhat of the general variety, but much of the goods were imported from Germany. Of course, all the glasswares from Allowaystown were represented there. When Wistarburg was in operation, Wistar set up a general store for the community that actually ran for 30 years. So it wasn't just a manufacturing facility, it was a place where his workers lived. They had businesses they could buy, things they needed to live, clothing, food, etc. So the total cottage industry in one swoop valley here in Allowaystown. The Glassworks, Wistar, seeing the death of the pane glass available in colonies, decided to pursue this for glassmaking. On a trip back to Germany while sailing down the Delaware River, he and his crew were forced by a raging storm to take shelter in Alloway Creek. This is how he found his manufacturing place here in Alloways. So a storm pulled them off the Delaware River and brought them up Alloway Creek. They sailed all the way up on the keel of a boat bottomed out and disembarked in what we know as Alloway Town, New Jersey, the Alloway Lake, which is located just to my right. Upon disembarking, he and his crew took shelter and camped on one side of the creek. At the onset of the morning, they explored the local topography and were very impressed to find that it contained many of the ingredients to make glass. The natural resources are as follows. Seemingly unlimited hardwood timber here, a lot of oak, red oak, white oak, and a plethora of clay, the proper clay for building bricks to make kilns. And just a stone's throw away, out in the fields around us here, is the finest sand they'd ever seen for glassmaking. After the exploratory excursion, they inquired with some locals about the owner of some of the properties. In making his decision to purchase the Alloway Town property, he had the great foresight to see that the rural communities where the numbers of inhabitants were rapidly increasing. From the beginning of Wistar's venture, it was a partnership between him and 4 glassblowers, known as the United Glass Company, and that's what they were called while they were still in Germany. So Wistar has the idea. He basically makes a partnership with 4 individuals and they come over. Perhaps these artisans decided, like their countrymen, that America could provide more opportunity than Europe. With the glass industry in decline in Germany in the early 18th century, with their specialized skills and limited personal resources, however, such craftsmen would have to wanted to be sure that they'd be willing to find investors to underwrite this endeavor. They approached a German businessman for capital who Wistar knew, and I believe Franklin also knew him, and Wistar and Franklin were neighbors in the Philadelphia market, who in turn proposed the idea to Wistar for their mutual benefit. The glass market was difficult in the colonial era prior to 1738, but Wistar was encouraged by the potential demands. Philadelphia's 2 newspapers published in 1720, and they carried only 3 advertisements in these papers for glass, for pane glass, for blown glass, etc. But by 1740, there were 20 merchants who were carrying glassware as part of a general stock. So it was exponentially growing in just a matter of a few years. While much of the glass used in the 17th century America came from Venice or other continental glassmaking centers, the occurrence of colonial glass in the colonies diminished significantly in the 18th century with the rise of the English glass industry. Just as the British government sought to prevent the importation of goods from the continent. So remember, in the beginning, Britain wanted to have us produce cheap goods and sell back to them. That was part of the situation of having the colonies. It was also determined to discourage rival manufacturers in the colonies themselves. Central to English colonial policy was the understanding that colonies would provide markets, not competition for Britain on British products. Not surprisingly, the erection of the Wistar Glassworks and the fact that it was brought to perfection was quickly recorded by the Lords Commissioners for Trade and Plantations through the customs collector at the port of Salem, New Jersey. Again, going back to the first quarter of the 18th century. Richard Wistar said it was not for honor of England to suffer manufactories in the colonies. While some colonial authorities seemed to ignore the Crown policy toward manufacturers, the New Jersey House of Representatives seemed, in the opinion of the Wistars, to be acting against the interest of the colonies when the House determined to increase the taxes levied on glassworks. The partners petitioned for relief, pointing out that the making of a glass item is of a considerable advantage to the county, not only as it saves the money, but that must otherwise be sent abroad for that commodity, but it also brings in cash for quantities exported to other colonies. British policy, notwithstanding, stated that it is not unusual, a thing wise governments to encourage new manufactures by granting boundaries and immunities to those who introduce them. In the same period, the company paid county taxes that had risen dramatically. In 1746, the Glassworks paid 20 shillings beside an additional charge levied on Worcester for his role as a merchant. The following year, the glass house's tax was 40 shillings, and by 1949, the amount was increased to £3. Indeed, the general feeling in the province was that the glassworks were very profitable, though the Worcester themselves claimed that the works yielded very small profits and had been of greater benefit to the public than their own pockets. And this is a statement that can always be termed and made and thought out as being quite questionable. In some quarters, domestic manufacturing began to be encouraged and supported, while to the Crown, their importance and success were minimized. The governor of New Jersey in 1752, Jonathan Belcher, was one of the many governors who were asked to submit a report of the manufacturers in their provinces. The next governor to file a report in New Jersey was the notorious William Franklin, the son of Dr. Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin referred to the reports from the other provinces about what his son's response would be. They are all very much in the same strain, that there are no manufacturers of any consequence. All speak of the dearness of labor that makes manufacturing impracticable. These accounts are very satisfactory here and were introduced to Parliament in disguise to avoid the notice of colonial resolutions. You have only to report a glass house, report window, glass, and bottle. Governor Franklin understood the implication his report to Whitehall, which included the following disdainful description and dissertation of the Wisterberg glass houses here in Allowaystown, which was erected 20 years ago prior to this in Salem County, and which makes bottles and a variety of coarse-rimmed glass for windows used only in some houses on the poorest sort of people. The profits of this work have not hitherto been sufficient, it seems, to induce any person to set up more of the right kind in this colony. So he was badgering the glass house, saying that they only make glass for the poor in Salem County and the destitute. In the late 17th century, British glassware disappeared from the colonial marketplace as a result of the Townshend Acts and the non-importation agreement. This had a significant impact on America's glass industry. A few colonists decided to start up new glass houses. Henry William Stittle, who had been making glass in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania since 1764, hired English glass blowers to create English-style glass to fill in the void of the marketplace. Richard Wistar could have followed suit, but instead he stayed with Germanic craftsmen. Some colorless and colored table glass has been tried at Wisterberg, and this time, but the main focus of production was utilitarian. Wistar did remind the public that because of this glass is of American manufacture, it is consistently clear of the duties of American manufacture. Duties the Americans so justifiably complain of. And even today they do complain of. And at present it seems peculiarly that interest of America to encourage our own manufacture, more especially upon those which duties have been imposed for the sole purpose of raising revenue. Worcester's position was ironic because he had been and continues to be an importer of English window and table glass. Little is known about Worcesterburg during the years of the American Revolution. So it sits in a small valley about 300 yards from me now, and today is a field with greenhouses. Glass continued to be made in the early years of the American Revolution, but the factory seems to have been closed down its operations sometime in late 1776 or 1777. So the revolution is on, and they closed the glass houses down. A letter written from the glass house in January of 1778 indicates that almost everyone had left the premises by this state. 2 months later, the New Jersey State Militia moved its headquarters into the glasswork in Allowaystown. Richard Wistar advertised the property for sale, but it remained for his children to divide up and later divide the land up also. He died a year later and had no will. The beginning of the glasswork. Wistar's plans for the glassworks must have been well underway in 1738, because that year it required over 2,000 acres of land along Alloway Creek, 8 miles from Salem, New Jersey. On colonial maps, the glass house is designated Glass H from the least 1758 to 1776. Wistar's choice of a well-wooded craft indicates attention to tremendous fuel needs of the glass furnaces. Locating glassworks of navigable water was important for the transportation of raw materials and finished products. Benjamin Franklin must have echoed Wistar's reasoning when he advised another potential glass manufacturer that by means of navigable water, you can carry your glass to the market much, much cheaper and with less risk of breakage. In a Philadelphia newspaper, the following advertisement gave details of Wistar's Glassworks. The glass manufactory in Salem County, West Jersey, is for sale, with 1,500 acres of land adjoining. It contains 2 furnaces, all with the necessary ovens, and colonial stations for glass, drying wood. Contiguous to the manufacturing are 2 flattening ovens in separate houses, a storehouse, a pothouse, a house fitted with tables for cutting of glass, a stamping mill, a rolling mill, for the preparing of clay, for making of pots, and at a suitable distance are 10 dwelling houses for the workmen to live, as likewise a large mansion house containing 6 rooms on a floor with break house and wash house. Also, a convenient storehouse. There are about 250 acres of clear land within a fence. These is movable meadow, which produces hay and pasturage. So this movable meadow can be cultivated, cut down, replanted. So for different reasons for particularly on the type of season that we're employing. There is a stabling sufficient for 60 heads of cattle. So remember, they needed cattle to pull sleds down to the boats, the finished glass, with a large barn, granary, a wagon house. The unimproved land is well wooded, and 200 acres more of meadow may be bought. So he had in mind thought of expansion. The situation and convenience for procuring materials are equal, if not superior, to any place in New Jersey. We talked about wood, clay, and the finest sand. The main building included 2 furnaces where the glass was melted and warped. The necessary ovens probably included a fretting oven where preliminary melting took place, as well as there where glass was generally cooled and annealed. The wood for these furnaces had to be fairly dried. Ancillary buildings containing the flattening ovens for making window glass and the equipment needed to cut the large sheets into panes of the different sizes. More specific information about the operation of the glass houses can be learned from Benjamin Franklin. In 1746, he received a letter from Thomas Darling of New Haven, who wanted to build a glass house in Connecticut. Darling had heard of Wistar's undertaking and sent Franklin a list of detailed questions. Franklin was in a good position to answer the questions and answer this query complete. He was a next-door neighbor of Wistar on Market Street, and the request came just as the time when Franklin was working closer with Wistar on 2 trips to Alloway on production of glass, needed for his scientific instruments and glass harmonica. Franklin describes the furnace as a rectangular one, typical of the best German technology, about 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, 6 feet high, and having no grate. The fire being made on its floor, each side of the furnace or bank of the same materials with the furnace, on which the pots of metal stand, or 3 or 4 on each side or side by side, were placed. He noted that the furnace was built of bricks and of white clay, which needed to be renewed every blast. As Wistar told Governor Belcher of New Jersey, the day of the furnished bottoms was built poor, but often gave way. Franklin reported that the glass house consumed 2,000 cords of wood per season, just a phenomenal amount of timber. The heat of the furnace was so intense that the New Jersey climate, the glass blowers could only work from October to May, so they needed to work when it was in cooler times. Finding suitable clay for the pots was a continuous problem, although the Alloway Creek was lined and still is lined with acceptable clay, and it does play havoc with our home foundations and things of that sort. Franklin complained that they had initially imported clay from England, but once the source in the creek bed had been found, there was one major problem averted. Wistar eventually felt that the Alloway Creek bed was so valuable, he refused to reveal the whereabouts. So all these natural resources, Wistar's keeping quiet: timber, sand, clay. South Jersey sand was the primary ingredient of Wistarburg glass, with additions of pot ashes and lime. Other ingredients, such as manganese, were needed for the refined table glass sort. As glassmakers have done throughout history, the Wistarburgs recycled broken bits of glass, we'll call it cauls, to facilitate the melting and coloring of their batches. Let's talk about the workers. Many of the first ones came to Germany. However, Wistar came to the idea of glassworks, the man responsible for the realization of his dream. He didn't want to be a button maker. He had a passion for making glass. So who helped him get into this dream were these 4 German immigrants who traveled, as we said, from Rotterdam to America, specifically to build the Wistarburg Glassworks. They all had experience in glassmaking in one way, shape, or another, either by growing up or with it in working around their lives, or their younger lives, I must say. The operations of the glassworks required many hands beside the skilled glassblowers. According to Richard Wistar, the company employed 28 people in addition to woodcutters in the Midlands in around 1750. These would have included stonemasons to repair or rebuild various furnaces, men to stoke the open fires, and others to haul the finished glassware. So the finished glassware would be across where the Woodstown Alloway Road is. It would be a sled cart would be pulled by oxen to the bed of the creek, of the bank of the creek, and put on flatboats and taken to the Delaware. For some of these tasks, the Wisters engaged local laborers from Alloway's town on a daily or weekly basis. But like many others in the colonies, they also relied heavily upon the labor of indentured servants. For Europeans who wished to emigrate to the New World, but lack of the means to pay for the transatlantic crossing, there was an option of traveling from, again, continental Europe to here to work. In exchange for the cost of passage, a person sold his labor for a time period, typically 4 years. So you catch a boat here, you pay back with 4 years of free labor with your master. During that time, his master would provide lodging, food, and clothes. The number of newspaper notices from the Wisters as well as the other employees indicates that retaining servant labor was a chronic problem to keeping the servant labor on the land that you're working. This situation was exacerbated during the French and Indian War, when the indentured servants became the special prey or armor recruiting sergeants. Pressure to meet quotas, recruiters scoured the countryside in search of able men. Wisterburg would have been a typical stop on their agenda, trying to provide a range of tricks to free them from their servitude. Indentured servants were natural candidates, such as men who were glad to get rid of any such slavery out of their lives, but these people are always prone to running away. Worcester, on so many occasions, complained to the local and state government for relief protection of his process. His protest centered on the lost investment of his servant-turned-soldiers. So the U.S. government, U.S. colonies would send these people out to places of work, and they'd literally pull the servants or the slaves away. So it was a very unstable labor situation. Worcester said he could not operate his business with hired hands, and if more his servants were enlisted, he would be disabled from carrying on. Worcester waved aside the consequences, the shutdown that would have on his own finances, but hoped to appeal to his lordship's compassion by noting that several of the company were really poor people whose long labor hours to bring the glassworks to perfection would be for the night or for the naught. In Worcester's record book, glass production continued unabated throughout the 17th century. The value of the glass produced in 1761 through 1762 season did drop by 40%, but this was probably due to the death of both William Wenzel and Caspar Worcester, two of its founders, in the summer of 1761. Window panes and bottles, so two entirely different scenarios of producing 18th century wares by hand. The primary purpose of the Wisterburg Glassworks throughout its history was to create utilitarian projects needed in the daily lives of the colonists. These fall into two major categories: window panes and bottles and containers. By the time the glassworks were erected, window glass was erected in the middle colonies as late as 1756. However, a southern importer wrote that none but the better sort of people gaze their houses. The same merchant also reported that panes of 7 and 9 inch would never sell in this country, and that sashes in general are of 8 to 10 inch variety. By 1752, most of the 22,849 feet of Worcester glass in stock in Caspar Worcester's Philadelphia store was in the 8x size. Demand apparently increased during the 1760s in window glass of other sizes, because in 1756 Richard Worcester advertised most sizes of glass window panes as 9x11, 8x10, and 6x8. According to his 1769 advertisement, Uncommon sizes under 16 and 18 are also cut on short notice. The cost of window glass valued with the size. In 1752, the New Jersey panes ranged from 6 and 7 pence per foot. Richard's brother in the glass family of window glass of New York, which he claimed to be sold at a lower rate and can be imported from Europe. Richard Wister's mention of flattening houses in his 1780 description of the Glassworks facilities indicates that window glass was manufactured there by the cylinder technique, which I hope we're going to catch up later on and get a free flow of how this technique worked in the podcast. In this process, the gaffer blew a shaped or long hollow cylinder, which was about 1 foot in diameter and up to 4 feet in length. This was then slit lengthwise and placed on an iron shovel in a special flattening oven where the heat would cause the cylinder to unfurl into a flat sheet. Once annealed, the plate was cut into size into panes on the desired sizes that were required. These could be quite even in thickness, but also had wavy marks as a result of the hot glass coming into contact with the metal shovels. There was no evidence that bull's eye panes were ever made in Wisterburg, and they're the round pane in the center of a midsection door on an 18th and 19th century clock. These were produced using the crown method of making window glass. A gather was shaped on a flattened globe. Then the solid iron rod, known as a pontil, was attached to the flat side of the blowpipe and was cracked off. By spinning the reheated crown on the pontil, the hole left by the blowpipe was enlarged and the disc flattened out onto the large circular sheet. When the pontil was removed, a scar or bullseye remained. The Wisters imported English crown glass, implying that this type of window glass was not made in Alloway's town. Richard Wister remarked to a Wistar glass maker that half of his customers would only be satisfied with imported crown glass. For regular windows, London crown glass was most desirable, but quantities of less desirable grain in tinted Bristol and Newcastle windows were the luxury. And these windows were of crown glass and were exported to the colonies. Common cylinder window glass from Newcastle was on occasion considered so miserable a color, but was no heavier than the crown. Nearly 8,000 bottles were in Caspar Worcester's market in his Market Street shop. But can you imagine 8,000 bottles in a small 18th century boutique? That's crazy. They range from gallon bottles at 17 shillings, a dozen to smaller pocket bottles valued at 3.5 shillings a dozen. The Glassworks produced most sorts of bottles. This included the standard wine-type bottles with squat or cylinder bodies and long necks from quarts to gallon capabilities. Customers should also place orders of specialized sizes and shapes from Worcester. Wisterburg bottles had to compete with thousands of English bottles exported annually to colonial America. The English ones were renowned for their sturdiness and were usually blown off at a very dark, thick green glass. A desired result of a high temperature coal furnaces used in English glass houses. The typical English bottle was made with high kick or push-up in the bottom, which had a slight applied string trim at the lip. Many were personalized with the applied blob or seal or glass into which they impressed the name or initials of the owner. Often, these seals were dated. So this is that impression in a panel of this bottom of Madeira, done since the early 18th century. You can put less into it, so the bottler is making more money, so it's a good thing. The bottle, made for Richard Wistar of New Jersey glass houses, follows the English fashion, which carries a seal on the initials of R.W., Richard Wistar. So the really fines in the glassmaking would have R.W. on them. Its straight-bodied shape parallels that bodies of the English bottles in the mid-18th century. The Wisterberg's bottle varies markedly from the English examples in other respects also. It has thin walls of clear, light green glass. There is only a slight concavity in the bottom, and the pontil mark is much smaller than the so-called sand pontil marks even on the many English bottles. The RV bottle was turned with an oval lip, giving it a rounded profile. A plain bottle excavated from the mid-18th century in a Philadelphia archaeological site and another in the collection of the Salem County Historical Society share these same traits and can be positively attributed to the Wisterberg enterprise, which is right here. Fragments that which these bottles have been found at this site at the Wistar factory. An extensive study of electricity began in the late 17th to 18th century. Glass tubes played a crucial role in such experiments. The Dr. Benjamin Franklin was such a driving force of such experiments, beginning with his experiments and observations on electricity in 1774, and his invention of the lightning rod, which made him world famous. The experiments engendered such interest that Franklin caused a number of glass tubes to be blown at Wistar's glass house. Franklin provided these tubes to many of his friends, who were also producing electric parlor tricks, for he thought that their exhibition of these tricks would further the interest of the newfound interest of electricity throughout the world. So a great marketing tool by the doctor. Franklin corresponded with a number of prominent columnists about electrical science and undertook to provide individuals as well as institutions with apparatus, including tubes. In one of these letters, Franklin mentions that the Wistar-made glass has a greenish cast, but the glass of clear and hard, and I think better for electrical experiments than the green. So the white colorless glass is that more found in London, which is not so hard. Indeed, the lead hardened formula composition of English lead glass would have been softer than the green. Non-lead glass produced in New Jersey, based on Franklin's descriptions, a tube at the American Philosophical Society and another at the Library Company are attributed to Wisterberg. According to the inventory of the Wistar store taken at the time of Caspar's death, electrical tubes were valued at 2 shillings apiece. Beside electrifying tubes, the Wistars also produced other glasswares to the colonial scientist. In addition, Wisterberg produced the donuts for bowls for Franklin's glass harmonica. The only time Franklin ventured down to Salem County, New Jersey, was to meet with Wistar at the Samuel Shivers house in historic Woodstown, New Jersey. There, they discussed in the grand reception room on 2 occasions the dimensions and type of glass required, and also during the second meeting examined some prototypes. Let's talk about table glass now. Benjamin Franklin was pleased with Wistar's scientific glass, but like most Philadelphians, he prefers English glass accoutrements on his dining table. And Franklin had a phenomenal house on Market Street, a house with all the downstairs with all of his scientific instruments strung throughout. But these individuals, they understood the prevailing taste for refined English lead glass. Some of Wistar imported glass from Britain to sell along with their own utilitarian wares in his Philadelphia shop. Some used tumblers, decanters, inkstands, salt, and drinking glasses, inventory when Caspar Worcester died, and could have been of British manufacture. Tablewares were never considered a significant aspect of production at Wisterberg, and none were ever advertised. Material in the Worcester papers and objects that have descended in the Worcester family indicates that some tablewares were made. However, archaeological excavations have also yielded significant evidence where Worcester shop once stood. Over the years, the Worcester enterprise has been credited at the root of South Jersey style table glass. These objects were fashioned from unrefined bottle or window glass and decorated with moldings or applied pattern. And tooled ornament, I must say. So when we say that, tooled ornament around the perimeter. Such characteristics are best interpreted within the German Bohemian style, transplanted to New Jersey and other parts of the country. Most of the glassblowers in America's 18th century glasshouses were immigrants from that area of Europe. Some of these craftsmen worked at more than one glass house, so there could only be strong technical and scientific and stylistic similarities among colonial glassmakers. The Worcester bowls are plain for pattern molding, either a 16th or 20 ounce ribs. An example at the Newark, New Jersey Museum was patterned with vertical ribbing over swirled ribbing for a basket weave effect. The molding on the bowl from the Salem County Historical Society is quite faint, but a horizontal emphasis was achieved by means of threading trailed around the rim of the bowl. The bowl in the Newark Museum is the most elaborate of the group that I've seen, which has handles that are pulled and pinched out onto finer grips. Another object that can represent the kind of the finest tableware made at Wisterberg over the last period of operation is the green glass salt dish, and it's in Winter Tour Museum. Its domed and folded foot point to an 18th century date in continental European inspiration. Salt was among the products listed in the 1752 inventory of Caspar Worcester's store. Many objects were blown of green glass according to the factory accounts. But blue glass was made on a very limited scale at the Alloway factory, as shown in the survival of the three objects of the Worcester family. These include to have led to the attribution of several related colorless objects, including a green bucket. Survival of these three objects of the Worcester family, these in turn have led to the attribution of several related colorless objects, including that green bucket. In the 1760s, when English glass disappeared from the market in the wake of colonial importation agreements, Worcester's workmen may well have increased their experimentation with colorless glass. There is some lead in the Worcester's taper sticks and buckets that is probably due to the result of lead collet used in the batch. There is no evidence, however, that Worcester ever made glass from raw materials. So it was simply a thought of something to refurbish your broken parts of glass. So let's conclude here. There is still much more to be learned about Worcester. We hope there is, because the inventories and all of our information that we know of has become very slimmed down. The story spans most of the 18th century, is closely interwoven in the aesthetic, social, political, and socio-economic events of the mid-Atlantic colonies. Wisterberg was the first commercially successful glassworks in America and laid the groundwork for the industry that would eventually flourish in the 19th century. Yet these German Quakers made very little fanfare about their manufacturing effort. Thanks to everyone for joining us on episode 4, Wisterberg Glass on the Historic Preservationists. I'm Gregg Perry, signing out. Thanks for being with us. Here, we're at the Gloucester County Historical Society, just looking at a picture from Wisterberg from about 1750. I just want to sort of get with the camera, just take a note of the beautiful waves that they put in there. It's just minute, very difficult to do back in the time period, but just waves moving around the entire piece. And just look at the crudeness of the handle. I mean, here's where the pull-off was, and it's just like a blurb that glued it on here, and then this was onto the pipe going back, and he was turning this. So here's the break-off point. So just a wonderful piece of antiquity here from Allowaystown, New Jersey, from Wisterberg, and very fortunate to hold it in my hand here at the Gloucester County Historical Society. So